Wyoming Territory, 1873. The land was a study in brutal honesty. It made no promises of gentleness, offering only vast, aching space under a sky so wide it could swallow a man's soul whole. For Ethan Blackwood, that honesty was a comfort. The wind that scoured the high plains and carved the granite faces of the Bighorn Mountains was a known quantity. It did not lie or deceive. It simply was. Like him, it existed in a state of stoic solitude, a force that bent the pines but never broke them. His ranch was nestled in a valley that acted as a windbreak, a small concession to comfort in a life that had been stripped of it. He stood on the porch of the cabin he had built with his own hands, the raw pine weathered to a soft silver gray, and watched the sun bleed across the eastern horizon. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and cold stone, a clean, lonesome smell that had become the only perfume he knew. His world was one of ordered, repeating patterns. The sun rose, he worked. The sun set, he rested. The seasons turned, he endured. He had built this life deliberately, brick by painful brick, over the wreckage of another. The war had taught him the fragility of man, and the fever that followed had taught him the fragility of everything else. Love, hope, a future, they had all turned to dust in his hands, leaving behind only the bitter grit of memory. So he had come west, seeking a place where the silence was loud enough to drown out the ghosts. He found it here, in the shadow of the mountains, where the only demands were those of the land itself. It demanded strength, and he had that. It demanded resilience, and he had that in spades. It demanded nothing of his heart, which was a mercy, for he was certain there was nothing left there to give. He was 34 years old, but felt a century had passed over him. His reflection, when he caught it in the cabin window, showed a man carved from the same unforgiving material as the landscape. His hair was dark as raven feathers, his eyes a startling, pale gray that seemed to hold the cold light of a winter sky. There were lines etched around those eyes and at the corners of his mouth, not from laughter, but from years of squinting into the sun and holding his jaw tight against the world. He was tall and lean, with the roped muscle of a man who swung an axe and threw a rope for a living. He had learned long ago that self-reliance was the only true currency in this world. Attachments were a liability, a weakness that could be exploited by a cruel and indifferent fate. A man survived alone. It was the first and last commandment of his life. A distant sound, thin and reedy, sliced through the morning quiet. The weekly stagecoach from Cheyenne. It was a sound that always set his teeth on edge, a reminder of the world he had left behind, a world of noise and people and complications. It was an intrusion, a brief tear in the fabric of his carefully constructed peace. He watched the dust plume rise from the valley floor miles away, a golden phantom crawling along the dirt track that passed for a road. The coach would stop in Redemption Creek, a town that was little more than a single dusty street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office. He rarely went to town, preferring to have his supplies delivered by a boy from the store. But today, he needed to speak with Sheriff Brody about a string of rustlers that had been growing bolder in the territory. It was a necessary evil, an interaction he had been putting off. He saddled his horse, a powerful buckskin named Stone, the animal's movements as economical and silent as his own. As he rode, the landscape unfolded around him. Wild lavender grew in stubborn purple patches among the sagebrush. It sent a fleeting, gentle counterpoint to the harshness of the terrain. He kept his eyes on the horizon, his thoughts as sparse as the trees on the high ridges. He planned his conversation with the sheriff, the words already forming in his mind. Terse, practical, direct. He would state the facts, offer his help in tracking, and then he would retreat back to his valley, back to the silence. It was a simple plan, but the land, for all its honesty, was also full of surprises. And the dust cloud on the horizon was bringing a complication he could never have anticipated, a disruption that would shatter the quiet of his world like glass against stone. The stagecoach was not just carrying mail and supplies. It was carrying a woman from another world, a woman who was about to become his problem. Clara Mae Thompson stepped down from the stagecoach, her foot sinking into the fine, cinnamon-colored dust of Redemption Creek's main street. She felt the gazes of the few men loitering on the boardwalk like a physical touch, a mixture of curiosity and appraisal that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. After weeks of travel from Boston, every bone in her body ached, and her navy blue traveling suit, once the pinnacle of modest fashion, was rumpled and coated with a film of grime that felt a mile deep. She clutched her handbag, its leather worn smooth from her anxious grip, and surveyed the town. It was so much smaller, so much rougher than she had imagined. The wooden buildings looked temporary, as if they might be swept away by the next strong wind, and the silence between the gusts was profound, broken only by the jingle of harnesses and the distant clang of a hammer on an anvil. She was 26 years old, an orphan since the age of 18, and had spent the last 8 years as a governess to a family whose children had finally outgrown her. She was educated, she was resilient, but she was utterly alone. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like a lifeline, a respectable and honest proposition from a Mr. Elias Vance, a rancher seeking a wife to help build a life in the promising Wyoming territory. His letters had been articulate, kind, and filled with descriptions of a thriving homestead and a future bright with possibility. He had sent money for her passage. He was to be waiting for her here, a tall man with fair hair. He had written, holding a copy of Great Expectations. She scanned the small collection of people near the coach, her heart beginning a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. There was no one matching his description. There was no one holding a book. The driver unloaded her trunk, dropping it onto the dusty ground with a thud that seemed to punctuate her growing dread. "That's everything, miss," he said, tipping his hat before climbing back on his seat, eager to be on his way. The coach rumbled off, leaving her standing beside her sole worldly possession in the middle of a town where she knew no one. The sun was relentless, beating down on her head, and the dust swirled around her ankles. A wave of dizziness washed over her, born of exhaustion, hunger, and the cold, sharp spear of fear. What if he was simply late? Or what if something had happened? But a deeper, more terrible thought began to surface, a suspicion she had pushed away during the long journey. What if it had all been a lie? Ethan had concluded his business with Sheriff Brody more quickly than expected. The sheriff, a man whose weary eyes had seen too much, agreed that the rustlers were a problem that needed a firm hand. They agreed to ride out with the posse at the end of the week. As Ethan left the small office, his gaze fell upon the woman standing alone by the side of the road. She was a stark contrast to her surroundings, a delicate porcelain figure set down in a dusty blacksmith shop. Her clothes, though travel-worn, spoke of the East, of cities with paved streets and gas lamps. Her hair, the color of spun honey, had escaped its neat bun and coiled in soft tendrils around a face that was pale with fatigue and something else, a dawning panic that was plain to see even from a distance. He recognized her type. He had seen them before, women who came west with hope in their hearts and stars in their eyes, only to find the reality was a much harsher thing. They were often deceived, abandoned, or simply unprepared for the unforgiving nature of the frontier. His first instinct, honed by years of self-preservation, was to turn away, to mount his horse and ride back to the sanctuary of his valley. She was not his concern. Her problems were her own. But then he saw her sway, one gloved hand rising to her forehead as if to ward off a blow. Her shoulders, held so rigidly straight a moment before, began to tremble. Something inside him, a rusty, long-dormant mechanism of decency, ground into motion. He could not just ride away and leave her to collapse in the dust. It was not in him, no matter how much he wished it were. He moved toward her, his stride long and purposeful. He saw the moment she became aware of him, her wide, hazel eyes fixing on him with a flicker of alarm. They were beautiful eyes, he noted with a detached part of his brain, the color of moss and whiskey, and currently filled with a desperate, hunted look. He stopped a few feet from her, careful not to crowd her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that felt rough from disuse. "Are you in some trouble?" Clara stared up at the man who had materialized before her. He was immense, not just in height, but in presence. He stood with a stillness that was unnerving, as if he were a part of the landscape itself, as rooted and unmovable as the mountains on the horizon. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, assessed her with an unnerving directness, and she had the distinct impression that he saw everything. Her fear, her foolishness, her utter desperation. She swallowed, her throat dry and thick with dust. I am waiting for someone," she managed, her voice thin and unsteady. "A Mr. Elias Vance. He was to meet me." Ethan's expression did not change, but a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or grim recognition, passed through his gray eyes. He knew the name. Elias Vance was a fiction, a name used by a swindler who had passed through the territory months ago, cheating ranchers in card games and selling false land claims before disappearing. He had heard whispers that the man had also been running a cruel mail-order bride scheme, taking the women's travel money and whatever dowry they might possess. He looked at the woman before him, at her fine, impractical clothes and the hopeful desperation in her eyes, and he knew. "Ma'am," he said, his tones softening almost imperceptibly, "there is no Mr. Vance here. Not anymore. I believe you have been deceived." The words, spoken with such quiet finality, struck her with the force of a physical blow. The last fragile thread of her hope snapped. The world tilted violently, the edges of her vision blurring and darkening. The heat, the dust, the crushing weight of her predicament. It was all too much. Her knees gave way, and she felt herself falling, a sensation of complete and utter failure washing over her. She did not hit the ground. Strong arms encircled her, catching her and pulling her securely against a hard chest. The world smelled of leather, dust, and pine, a surprisingly solid and grounding scent. She was held fast, her head resting against a shoulder as solid as oak. For a moment, just a moment, she allowed herself the luxury of being held, of not having to be strong. Ethan adjusted his grip, easily holding her slight weight. He had not intended to touch her, but instinct had taken over. Her body was trembling against his, and he could feel the fine tremor of her fear and exhaustion. She felt fragile in his arms, like a bird with a broken wing. It was a feeling he had not experienced in a very long time, this sensation of holding another person's vulnerability in his hands. It was deeply unsettling. He was aware of the town's eyes on them now, of the curtains twitching in the windows of the general store. A woman in his arms in the middle of the street was gossip that would burn through Redemption Creek like a prairie fire. He had to get her out of sight. "Easy now," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Just breathe." He half-lifted, half-guided her toward the shade of the general store's porch, sitting her down on a wooden bench. He remained standing, creating a barrier between her and the prying eyes of the town, his broad shoulders shielding her from view. Clara took a shuddering breath, the scent of him still lingering in her senses. She looked up at him, her face flushed with a mixture of humiliation and a strange, unwelcome gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I am sorry. I do not normally. I am not so foolish." She fumbled in her handbag for a handkerchief, her movements clumsy. Her world had been upended in the space of a single sentence. She was stranded, penniless, and thousands of miles from anything familiar, a victim of a cruel and predatory lie. The shame of it was a hot, bitter taste in her mouth. She had believed the letters, had allowed herself to hope for a new beginning, and it had all been a phantom. Ethan watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw not foolishness, but a misplaced trust that the world had brutally corrected. He knew he should walk away now. He had done his duty as a decent man. He had kept her from fainting in the street. But her trunk still sat in the dust, a monument to her dashed hopes. Where'd she go? What would she do? Redemption Creek had no respectable boarding house, only a few rooms above the saloon that were not fit for a woman like her. The thought of her falling into the hands of someone who would take advantage of her vulnerability stirred something cold and protective in his gut. It was an unwelcome feeling, an entanglement he did not want. Yet he could not turn his back. His own ghost would not allow it. He thought of his wife, Eleanor, and how lost she would have been in such a situation. He let out a slow breath, the sound a quiet admission of defeat against his own better judgment. "My ranch is a few miles from here," he said, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "I have a housekeeper, an older woman named Martha. You could stay there for a few days, until you can make other arrangements." The offer hung in the air between them, a shocking and unexpected kindness. It was also a breach of his own most sacred rule: do not get involved. He was already regretting it, even as he said it. He saw the surprise and suspicion in her eyes, and he could not blame her. Her trust in the kindness of strangers had just been proven to be a catastrophic mistake. Clara looked from his stoic face to her trunk and back again. The offer was improper, of course. In Boston, the very idea of a single woman staying at a bachelor's home would have been scandalous. But this was not Boston. This was a place where the rules were different, and her options were non-existent. She had no money for a return ticket, no friends, no prospects. The man before her was an enigma. His eyes were hard, but his actions had been kind. He had not hesitated to help her. And the mention of a housekeeper, another woman, was a small anchor of propriety in a sea of uncertainty. She saw the conflict in his face, the reluctance warring with a sense of duty. He was not a man who made such offers lightly. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do that for me?" Ethan's gaze shifted to the distant mountains, their peaks sharp against the blue sky. "Because my mother raised me better than to leave a woman stranded in the dust," he said simply, his voice gruff. It was only part of the truth. The other part, the part that had to do with a grave on a hill and a promise he had failed to keep, was his own business. He looked back at her. "The offer is there. It is your choice." He was giving her an out, hoping she might refuse, that some other solution might present itself and release him from this unwanted responsibility. He waited for her answer, a muscle ticking in his jaw. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind. Clara looked at his hands. They were large, calloused, and capable. They were the hands of a man who worked, who built things, who fought for them. They were the hands that had caught her when she fell. She made her decision, not from a place of trust, but from a place of pure necessity. She had no other path. I will be very grateful, mister." She trailed off, realizing she did not even know his name. "Blackwood," he supplied. "Ethan Blackwood." He gave a curt nod. The matter settled. He felt a strange sense of resignation, as if he had just stepped off a cliff he had seen coming from a mile away. "Wait here." He turned and strode toward the general store, his boots leaving deep prints in the dust. He returned a few moments later with a boy who drove a small buckboard wagon. Ethan loaded her trunk onto the back himself, the heavy trunk seeming weightless in his arms. He then turned to his own horse, tied to the hitching post. "I will ride alongside," he said, not a suggestion, but a statement of fact. He helped her up into the wagon, his hand briefly closing over hers. Her skin was soft, a startling contrast to his own rough palm. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through him, an unwelcome spark of warmth in a place he had long thought cold and dead. He released her hand as if burned and swung himself into stone saddle. The journey to the ranch was made in near silence. The creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of Stone's hooves were the only sounds. Clara sat stiffly on the hard wooden seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She stole glances at Ethan Blackwood. He rode with an easy, confident grace, his back straight, his gaze constantly scanning the surrounding terrain. He seemed a part of the wild landscape, as at home here as the hawks circling in the sky above. He was a fortress of a man, walled off and self-contained. She wondered what lay behind those stone-gray eyes, what sorrows had carved those hard lines into his face. She was a stranger, a burden he had reluctantly taken on, and she was acutely aware of it. The wind picked up, whipping a strand of her honey-blonde hair across her face, and she tucked it back behind her ear, her heart a tangled knot of fear and a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. She had been saved from the dust, but she had no idea what she was riding into. The Blackwood Ranch was situated in a valley that seemed blessed by a gentler hand than the rest of the territory. A creek, lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves shimmered like silver coins in the breeze, snaked through lush pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. The cabin was larger than she had expected, solid and well-built, with a wide porch and 2 stone chimneys. It was a home, not just a shelter. It spoke of permanence and care. As they drew near, an older woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, and a surprisingly kind face emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on an apron. This had to be Martha. Ethan dismounted and addressed the woman. "Martha, this is Miss Thompson. She'll be staying with us for a few days." He offered no further explanation, and Martha, to her credit, asked for none. She simply looked at Clara, her sharp blue eyes taking in the rumpled dress, the exhausted pallor, and the deep-seated fear. A flicker of sympathy softened her features. "Of course," she said, her voice warm and practical. "Come inside, child. You look like you could use a hot meal and a soft bed." The simple, unconditional welcome was so unexpected that it brought tears to Clara's eyes. She blinked them back, fiercely, refusing to cry in front of these strangers. She was a guest here, an object of charity, and she would not be a weeping burden. Martha led her inside to a small, clean room with a simple wooden bedstead, a handmade quilt, and a window that looked out onto the mountains. It was Spartan, but it was a sanctuary. "You get yourself cleaned up," Martha said gently. "Supper will be ready in an hour." She left, closing the door softly behind her, granting Clara a moment of privacy she desperately needed. Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing under her weight. The reality of her situation crashed down on her again. She was in the home of a stranger, a man whose kindness felt like a duty he bore with grim reluctance. She was living on his charity, with no plan and no future. She opened her handbag and pulled out the small, leather-bound portfolio that held her few important papers: her birth certificate, her letter of recommendation from her former employer, and a packet of letters from Elias Vance. She stared at his elegant, looping script, the words of promise now mocking her. How could she have been so foolish, so naive? Downstairs, Ethan was washing his face and hands in a basin on the porch, the cold water a welcome shock. Martha came out and stood beside him, her arms crossed over her chest. She had been with him for 5 years, ever since he had built the ranch. She had known him when the silence in the house was a raw, open wound, and she knew him now that it had scarred over into a quiet, impenetrable wall. She was the only person whose presence he could tolerate for more than a few hours. "You didn't tell me we were expecting company," she said, her tone neutral. "It was not expected," Ethan replied, drying his face on a rough towel. He did not look at her. He knew what she was thinking. In 5 years, he had never brought a woman to this house. Not once. She was stranded in town, deceived by a man promising marriage. Martha nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "She has a gentle look about her, but there's steel in her spine, I think. She's just tired of holding herself up." She paused, then added quietly, "It's good to have another voice in this house, Ethan." "It has been quiet for too long." He did not reply, but walked past her into the main room, the muscles in his back tight. He did not want another voice. He had cultivated the quiet, needed it. Her presence was a disruption, a temporary inconvenience he would have to endure until she was gone. The sooner, the better. Supper was a quiet affair. The food Martha prepared was simple but delicious: roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread. Clara ate with a ravenous appetite she had not realized she possessed, embarrassed by her hunger but unable to stop. The silence at the table was thick and heavy. Ethan ate with an economy of motion, his focus entirely on his plate. He did not speak unless spoken to, and Clara was too intimidated and exhausted to initiate a conversation. Martha made a few attempts at small talk, asking Clara about her journey, but the answers were brief, and the conversation soon withered. The tension was a palpable thing, a fourth presence at the table. Clara felt like an intruder, a foreign object that did not fit in this quiet, ordered world. After the meal, Martha shooed Clara from the kitchen, insisting she rest. Ethan had taken a seat in a large leather chair by the stone fireplace, where a low fire crackled warding off the chill of the high country evening. The room was filled with the scent of wood smoke and old leather. Clara hesitated in the doorway, feeling she should say something to thank him again, but the words would not come. She felt awkward and out of place, a guest in a home where guests were clearly not the norm. She was about to retreat to her room when he spoke, his voice startlingly deep in the quiet room. "Sit down, Miss Thompson." It was not a question. She perched nervously on the edge of a straight-backed chair opposite him. The firelight flickered across his face, casting long shadows that made his features seem even more severe. He stared into the flames for a long moment before he spoke again. "Martha tells me you have spirit. You will need it." He finally turned his gray eyes on her, and their intensity made her feel as if he were looking straight through her skin to the frightened heart beneath. "What will you do?" The question was blunt, practical, and exactly what she had been dreading. I do not know," she confessed, her voice small. "I have some skills. I was a governess. Perhaps I could find a position, or work as a seamstress in town." The ideas sounded flimsy and pathetic even to her own ears. Redemption Creek did not seem like a place that had much need for governesses. "There are not many families here who can afford a governess," he stated, confirming her fears. "And the only work for a single woman in town is at the saloon. That is not a life for you." His tone was flat, matter-of-fact, but there was an undercurrent of something else there, a protective instinct that he seemed to be fighting. He was warning her, outlining the grim reality of her situation. He was making it clear that his charity was a temporary port in a storm, not a permanent harbor. Clara lifted her chin, a spark of defiance kindling within her. She would not be cowed. She had lost everything, but she had not lost her pride. "I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Blackwood. I will find something. I will not be a burden to you for long." A flicker of something that might have been respect showed in his eyes. He gave a slight nod. He fell silent again, returning his gaze to the fire. The silence stretched, but it was different now. It was less of an absence of sound and more of a space for thought. Clara found herself watching him, the way the firelight played on the strong column of his throat, the way his large hand rested on the arm of the chair. He seemed so self-contained, so utterly alone. She wondered what had made him that way. She found herself wanting to know, to understand the man who had, for reasons she could not fathom, rescued her. "You are not from here," she stated softly. It was not a question. His speech was educated, his mannerisms hinting at a different past. He did not look at her. "No," he said, his voice low. "I am from Virginia." The single word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Virginia. The war. She understood a little more. The war had left its mark on countless men, turning them into ghosts long before they were dead. "I lost my parents to influenza when I was 18, she heard herself say, the confession slipping out into the quiet room. "I have been on my own ever since. I thought coming west was a chance for a home. A family." The admission felt raw and vulnerable, but the quiet, firelit room seemed to demand honesty. She was sharing her own loss, offering it as a bridge across the silence between them. For the first time, Ethan looked at her with something other than detached assessment. He saw the flicker of old pain in her eyes, the echo of a loneliness that he knew all too well. He had not intended for this conversation to happen. He did not want to share vulnerabilities. But her quiet confession had disarmed him. "The war took my home," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "And the fever took my family." He said the words flatly, as if they were facts from a history book, but the muscle in his jaw clenched tight. He was speaking of his wife, Eleanor, and their infant son, Samuel. He had been away at the war, fighting in muddy fields for a cause he no longer believed in, while they had died in a clean bed, their bodies racked with a sickness he could not fight. The guilt was a constant companion, a cold stone in his gut. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Family. It was not the past tense she had expected. The sorrow in his voice, though fiercely contained, was immense. It radiated from him, a palpable cold that the fire could not touch. Suddenly, his solitude made sense. It was not a preference. It was a fortress built to protect a heart that had already been shattered. "I am so sorry," she whispered, the words utterly inadequate. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of dismissal. He had said more than he had intended, more than he had said to anyone in years. The vulnerability was uncomfortable, like an ill-fitting coat. He stood abruptly. "You should get some rest, Miss Thompson. Tomorrow will be a long day." He had retreated again, the walls of his fortress sliding back into place. He turned and left the room, leaving her alone with the dying fire and the weight of their shared confessions. She watched him go, and for the first time, she saw not just a hard, intimidating stranger, but a man drowning in a grief so profound he had chosen to build a life where no one could ever reach him. She had stumbled into his fortress by accident, and she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that her presence here was going to change everything. The next few days fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Clara insisted on earning her keep, and Martha, after a token protest, was glad for the help. Clara proved to be a quick learner and a hard worker. She helped with the cooking, the cleaning, the mending. She learned to knead bread, her soft hands growing tougher. She learned the difference between the calls of the various birds in the valley. She spent hours in the small garden Martha kept, weeding and watering, finding a simple, grounding pleasure in the feel of the cool earth. The physical labor was a balm to her troubled mind, and with every passing day, she felt a little bit of her strength returning. She saw Ethan only in the mornings and evenings. He would leave before dawn and return after dusk, his days spent working the vast stretches of his land. He remained distant, his conversations with her brief and practical. Yet she felt his eyes on her sometimes, a watchful, assessing gaze that she could not quite decipher. He saw her resilience, the way she refused to succumb to despair. He saw the way she spoke kindly to Martha, the way a genuine smile transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of fatigue and fear. Each day, she became less of a problem to be solved and more of a person, a woman of quiet strength and surprising determination. It was a dangerous observation, and he tried to ignore it. One afternoon, while sorting through her trunk to see if she had any fabrics she could use for mending, Clara's fingers brushed against a hidden pocket in the lining. Her father had been a meticulous man, a lawyer who believed in redundancies. Curious, she worked the stitches loose. Inside was a folded document, an old, water-stained deed of title. Her breath caught as she read the legal language. It was a deed for 160 acres of land in the Wyoming Territory, a parcel known as the Sweetwater Creek Claim, purchased by her father nearly a decade ago. It had been a speculative purchase, an investment he had likely forgotten. A map was attached, and as she studied it, she realized with a jolt that the land described was adjacent to the Blackwood Ranch. The deed was registered to her father, and as his only heir, it now belonged to her. And then she saw the name of the surveyor who had signed the original claim, Elias Vance. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. It had never been about marriage. It had never been about her. It had been about this land, this deed. Elias Vance, or whatever his real name was, must have known her father had died and that she was his heir. The entire courtship had been a charade to lure her west, to get his hands on this document. He likely intended to marry her and take control of the land, or perhaps just steal the deed and disappear. Her blood ran cold. The man was not just a swindler. He was a predator, and he still believed she had what he wanted. She was not just stranded. She was in danger. That evening, she waited for Ethan, her heart pounding with a new kind of fear. When he returned, weary from a day of mending fences on the northern range, she met him on the porch, the deed clutched in her hand. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to show you something. I believe I know why that man brought me here." She unfolded the document and explained her discovery. Ethan took the deed, his expression grim as he read it under the light of the lantern hanging by the door. His eyes scanned the map, and a low curse escaped his lips. "Sweetwater Creek," he said, his voice tight. "That creek is the only reliable water source in this part of the valley, aside from my own. Whoever controls that land controls the water. And without water, the rest of this land is worthless. He looked up at her, his gray eyes hard as flint. This isn't just about a plot of land, Miss Thompson. This is about power. There's a man, Silas Croft, a cattle baron for down south. He's been trying to buy up all the smaller ranches, trying to squeeze us out. He wants a monopoly on the water. I've heard whispers that he hires men to do his dirty work. Men like this Vance. The name Silas Croft sent a chill down Clara's spine. The threat was no longer a faceless swindler, but a powerful, greedy man. "What will he do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He will not give up," Ethan said, his voice grim. "Now that you are here, he knows the deed is in play. He will send someone. He will try to take it." He looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, and the protective instinct he had been fighting so hard roared to life. She was under his roof. She was under his protection. Whether he liked it or not, her fight was now his fight. "You're not safe," he said. "Not here, not in town. Not until this is settled." The very next day, the threat materialized. Two strangers rode into Redemption Creek. They were hard-faced men with guns tied low on their hips, and they started asking questions. Questions about the woman who had arrived on the stagecoach. Sheriff Brody sent a boy out to the ranch with a warning. Ethan received the news with a grim nod. It had started. He spent the rest of the day checking his rifle, oiling the action, and ensuring he had enough ammunition. He walked the perimeter of his property, his eyes missing nothing, his senses on high alert. The peace of his valley had been shattered. Clara watched him, a knot of fear and guilt tightening in her stomach. This was her fault. She had brought this danger to his door. "You should take me to town," she said to him that evening, her voice strained. "Leave me with the sheriff. This is not your battle, Mr. Blackwood." He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her, his expression unyielding. "Croft's men would have you out of that jailhouse in an hour, or they'd just wait until the sheriff's back was turned. You're safer here." He paused, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. "And their quarrel is with anyone who stands in Croft's way. I have been standing in his way for 5 years. This battle was coming. Miss Thompson, you just rang the bell for the first time." He used her given name. "Clara, you are safer here." The sound of her name on his lips, spoken in that low, rough voice, did something strange to her heart. It was a claim, a statement of responsibility. In that moment, they were no longer a reluctant host and a charitable burden. They were allies, bound together by shared danger. The fear was still there, a cold snake in her belly, but it was now mingled with something else, a fierce, unwavering trust in the man who stood before her. She would not run. She would stand with him. The attack came 2 nights later, under the sliver of a new moon. A sudden, frantic barking from Ethan's dog, Rip, was the only warning. Ethan was out of his bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers and grabbing the rifle that was always leaning by his door. He moved with a silent, deadly grace that spoke of old, hard-won experience. "Stay here," he commanded Clara and Martha, who had emerged from their rooms, their faces pale in the darkness. "Bar the door and stay away from the windows." He slipped out the back of the cabin, melting into the shadows. The night was alive with a tense, waiting silence. He could hear the soft crunch of boots on gravel from the front of the house. There were at least 3 of them. He circled around, using the barn and the corrals for cover. A muzzle flash lit up the darkness near the front porch, and the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the valley. A splinter of wood flew from the porch railing. They were not here to talk. Inside, Clara's heart was hammering against her ribs. She and Martha had pushed a heavy chest against the door, but it felt like a flimsy defense. She could not just cower in here while Ethan faced them alone. It was her fault they were here. She looked around the darkened room, her eyes falling on the spare rifle Ethan kept mounted over the fireplace. She had never fired a gun in her life, but her father had taught her how to load one, insisting it was a necessary skill for a woman traveling alone. Her hands trembling, she took it down. It was heavy, alien in her hands. She found the box of cartridges on the mantelpiece and, with fumbling fingers, began to load it, just as she had been taught. Outside, Ethan had worked his way to a position behind the woodpile, giving him a clear view of the front of the cabin. He saw two figures moving toward the house, while a third stayed back near the trees, providing cover. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafening in the night. One of the men cried out and fell, clutching his leg. The other two immediately returned fire, bullets thudding into the logs around him. He was pinned down. He needed a diversion. He needed to split their attention. As if in answer to his thought, a lamp suddenly lit in the upstairs window of the cabin. It was a clear target. A fool's move. He cursed under his breath, a surge of cold terror washing over him. Clara, what was she doing? The two remaining men turned their fire on the window, the glass shattering with a sharp crash. But the light had served its purpose. It drew their eyes for the crucial seconds Ethan needed. He sighted on the second man and fired again. The man staggered back and fell, silent. The third man, seeing he was now alone, broke from the cover of the trees and ran for the barn, likely seeking a better angle or a place to make stand. Ethan scrambled from behind the woodpile and ran in a low crouch toward the back of the house, intending to cut him off. He rounded the corner just as the barn door creaked open. He raised his rifle, but the man was faster, firing wildly. Ethan felt a searing, white-hot pain in his left shoulder. The force of the bullet spun him around, and he fell to his knees, his rifle clattering to the ground. His arm was useless, a dead weight, and the world began to gray at the edges. The man advanced on him, his pistol raised, a cruel smile on his face in the dim light. Suddenly, the back door of the cabin flew open. Clara stood there, silhouetted in the lamplight, the spare rifle in her hands. She was terrified, her whole body shaking, but her eyes were filled with a blazing, desperate courage. "Get away from him," she yelled, her voice high and strained. The gunman laughed, turning his attention to this new, less threatening target. "Look what we have here. Put the gun down, little lady. You don't want to get hurt." He took a step toward her. That was the opening Ethan needed. Ignoring the fire in his shoulder, he lunged forward with his good arm, tackling the man at the knees. They went down in a tangle of limbs. The pistol went off, the bullet harmlessly burying itself in the dirt. Ethan drove his fist into the man's jaw, once, twice. But his strength was fading fast, the blood loss making him dizzy. The man was bigger, stronger, and he began to get the upper hand, his fingers closing around Ethan's throat. Black spots danced in Ethan's vision. He was losing. Then he heard a sound he never expected. It was not a gunshot, but a solid, resonant thwack. Clara, seeing Ethan in trouble, had not tried to fire the unfamiliar rifle. Instead, she had reversed it, swinging the heavy wooden stock like a club with all her might. She brought it down on the back of the gunman's head. He grunted, his body going limp, and collapsed on top of Ethan. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the whimpering of the man Ethan had shot in the leg. Clara dropped the rifle and rushed to Ethan's side, helping him push the unconscious man off. "Ethan, you are hurt," she cried, her hands fluttering over the bloody tear in his shirt. "It is just my shoulder," he grunted, though the pain was a raging fire. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt. Her hair was a wild tangle, and in her eyes was the fierce, protective light of a she-wolf defending her own. She was not a delicate thing from the East. She was a survivor. She was magnificent. And in that moment, seeing her standing over him, having saved his life, the last of his carefully constructed walls did not just crack. They crumbled into dust. He had spent years believing that attachments were a weakness, that love was a liability that led only to pain. He had been wrong. This feeling that was surging through him, this overwhelming need to protect her, to keep her safe, to never let her go, it was not a weakness. It was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that mattered. "You saved my life," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "You saved mine first," she whispered, her hands now gently probing the wound. Tears streamed down her face, tears of fear and relief. "We must get you inside. We have to stop the bleeding." With Martha's help, they managed to get him into the house and onto a chair in the kitchen. The chaos of the fight was replaced by a frantic, focused purpose. Martha fetched bandages and whiskey, both for the wound and for the patient. Clara, her hand steady now, cut away the bloody shirt. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder. It was a painful, messy wound, but it could have been so much worse. As she worked, her touch gentle and sure, cleaning the wound with a tenderness that went far beyond mere nursing, Ethan watched her. He watched the way she bit her lip in concentration, the way the lamplight caught the honey gold of her hair. He had invited her into his home out of a grudging sense of duty, expecting her to be a fragile, temporary burden. He had been a fool. She had shown more courage tonight than most men he knew. She had faced down a killer to save him. She had become a part of this place, a part of his life, so seamlessly that he had not even realized it was happening. The thought of her leaving, of this house returning to its empty silence, was now unbearable. It was a hollow, aching void he could not face. After the wound was cleaned and tightly bandaged, and Sheriff Brody had been sent for, they were left alone in the quiet kitchen. Martha had gone to her room, sensing they needed the space. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a raw, trembling vulnerability. Clara was sitting across from him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she was not drinking. "I was so afraid," she said softly, not looking at him. "When I saw him standing over you, I thought he was going to kill you." Ethan reached across the table with his good hand and covered hers. His touch was warm and firm, a solid anchor in the swirling aftermath of violence. "Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent. She looked up, her moss and whiskey eyes wide and luminous with unshed tears. "When I thought they might get to you, when I saw you in that window, I realized something." He took a breath, the confession feeling like it was being torn from the deepest part of him. "I've been living like a dead man for 10 years, hiding from everything, from everyone. I thought it was safer. I thought it was stronger to be alone." He squeezed her hand gently. "I was wrong. Being alone is not strength. It is just empty. You came here and you filled a silence in this house I did not even know was there. Tonight, I was not just fighting for my land. I was fighting for you." The words were out, stark and honest in the quiet room. The last of his defenses were gone. "I love you, Clara. I think I have from a moment I saw you standing in the dust, looking so lost but refusing to break. I love your strength and your courage and the way you see the good in a world that has shown you so much bad." Clara's breath hitched, and a single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She had dreamed of hearing such words, but had never believed she would. Not from this man, this stoic, wounded soul who held his heart in a fortress of grief. She saw the truth of his words in his eyes, the raw, unguarded emotion there. It was terrifying and beautiful all at once. Her own feelings, which had been growing in the quiet spaces of the past weeks, a deep respect that had blossomed into a tender, hesitant affection, rose up to meet his confession. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She did not know what to say. It was too much, too fast. "You do not have to say anything," he said quickly, misinterpreting her hesitation as rejection. The fear of that was sharper than the pain in his shoulder. "I know this is sudden. I could not face another day without you knowing." He started to pull his hand away, but she tightened her grip, lacing her fingers with his. "No," she said, her voice stronger now. "Do not pull away. I feel it too. I've been so focused on surviving, I did not let myself see it. But it is there. I look at you, and I see a good and honorable man. I see a home. I see a future I had given up on." She gave him a watery smile. "I think, Ethan Blackwood, that I'm falling in love with you." A slow, wondrous relief washed over his face, erasing the lines of pain and tension. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, and it transformed him, making him look younger, chasing the shadows from his eyes. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Silas Croft will not stop. This is not over. But when it is, I do not want you to leave. I want you to stay. I want you to build a life with me here. As my wife." The proposal, coming so soon after the declaration, should have been overwhelming. But it felt right. It felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. This wild, beautiful land, this solid, quiet house, this complicated, honorable man. It was the home she had been searching for all her life. If you step into this wagon, everything changes. For both of us, he had not said, but she thought it now. It had been true. She had stepped into a new life. Yes, she whispered, the single word filled with all the hope and promise she had thought was lost forever. Yes, Ethan, I will marry you. Sheriff Brody and his deputies arrived just before dawn. They took the unconscious gunman and the one with the wounded leg into custody. The third man was found dead near the front porch. The prisoners were talkative, readily implicating Silas Croft in exchange for leniency. Armed with their testimony and the deed, which Clara willingly provided as evidence of motive, the sheriff rode out with a federal warrant for Croft's arrest. The reign of the greedy cattle baron was over. The external threat that had thrown them together had been vanquished, leaving only the quiet, hopeful space for their new beginning. A week later, with Ethan's arm in a sling but his heart lighter than it had been in a decade, he took Clara to the small, windswept hill behind the cabin. Two simple wooden crosses stood there, weathered by the sun and wind. Eleanor and Samuel Blackwood. He had never brought anyone here. It was his most private, sacred place of pain. He stood before the graves, Clara's hand held firmly in his. Eleanor, he said, his voice thick but steady, speaking to the memory of the woman he had first loved. This is Clara. She is the woman I'm going to marry. I wanted you to meet her. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. The past will always be a part of me. But Clara, she is my future. Clara's heart ached for the loss he had endured, but it swelled with love for the man he was, a man strong enough to honor his past while bravely embracing a new future. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise to help him build that future. Later that day, he presented her with a small, velvet-worn box. Inside was a simple gold ring with a tiny, seed pearl flower. It was my grandmother's, he said, his voice uncharacteristically shy. It is all I have left of my family from before. He was not just offering her a ring. He was offering her his lineage, his history, a place in a family she had never had. She let him slide it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Their wedding was a simple ceremony held on the porch of the cabin, officiated by a traveling preacher. The entire town of Redemption Creek seemed to be there. The initial gossip about the Eastern lady living at the Blackwood Ranch had been replaced by a deep and abiding respect after the story of the attack got out. They saw Clara not as an outsider, but as one of their own, a woman of grit and courage. They brought gifts of food and handmade quilts, their acceptance a warm and welcoming embrace. Martha wept openly, and Sheriff Brody stood as Ethan's best man, clapping him on his good shoulder with a wide grin. As Ethan and Clara said their vows, with the mountains as their witness and the valley as their home, it felt less like a beginning and more like a continuation of something that had been destined all along. They were two solitary souls who had found their other half in the most unlikely of circumstances, forging a love as strong and enduring as the land itself. 2 years later, the spring sun was a warm, benevolent hand on the valley. The ranch had prospered. The herd was larger, the pastures were greener, and a new wing had been added to the cabin, built from the same sturdy pine as the original. The home was filled with a warmth and life that went beyond the crackle of the fire. It was filled with laughter. Clara stood on the porch, her body full with the gentle swell of their second child. A small boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's hazel eyes toddled around her feet, chasing a butterfly with shrieks of delight. He was Samuel, named for the brother he would never know, a bridge between the past and the future. She watched as Ethan rode in from the fields, Stone moving with the same steady gait. But the man in the saddle was different. The hard, solitary lines of his face had softened. The perpetual watchfulness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, settled contentment. He smiled when he saw them, a genuine, easy smile that still made her heart leap. He swung down from the saddle, and swept their son into his arms, tossing him into the air, eliciting a peal of joyous laughter that echoed in the clear mountain air. He came onto the porch and kissed Clara, a long, lingering kiss filled with the easy intimacy of shared days and nights. "Everything all right?" he asked, his hand coming to rest on her belly, where he felt the faint flutter of the new life within. "Everything is perfect," she replied, leaning her head against his chest, the familiar scent of leather and pine and him a constant comfort. She looked out over the valley, their valley. The wild lavender was in bloom, its purple hue a soft haze over the landscape. It had been a long and perilous journey from the dust of Redemption Creek's Main Street to this porch, to this life. She had come west seeking a home, and she had found it, not in a plot of land or a prearranged agreement, but in the heart of a good, strong man. Ethan held her and his son, looking out at the empire of peace and happiness they had built together. He remembered the man he used to be, the man who believed that love was a weakness and solitude was strength. He had been so wrong. Love was not a weakness. It was the foundation upon which everything else was built. It was the water that made the barren land bloom. It was the force that had taken two broken, lonely people and made them whole. He looked down at his wife, at the incredible woman who had faced down his demons and her own, who had saved him in more ways than she would ever know. "I love you, Clara Blackwood," he said softly, his voice filled with a reverence that time had only deepened. She smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "I know," she whispered, "and I love you, Ethan. We are home." They stood together on the porch, a family, their roots sunk deep into the rich soil of the valley, their future stretching before them, as vast and as bright as the Wyoming sky.